The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Emma shifted her weight from one foot to the other, the pair of simple canvas shoes pressed tightly against her chest. Her faded jeans and plain jacket blended into the crowd of hurried shoppers circling the clearance racks, but she stood out in a way she hadn't meant to, still, silent, with tears prickling the corners of her eyes. She whispered to herself under her breath, barely audible even to her own ears. 3 months. 3 months of tips for these. The words weren't meant for anyone, just a quiet acknowledgement of how hard it had been to set aside even a few dollars at a time. The checkout line inched forward, but for Emma, the world seemed to stand still as she clung to the shoes, as if letting go might somehow erase the struggle that had brought her here. Brittany, the sales clerk, popped her gum loudly behind the register, flipping her glossy hair over one shoulder as she leaned toward a coworker. In a voice meant to be overheard, she laughed. Imagine crying over $10 shoes. Embarrassing. Her words sliced through the hum of conversations like a knife. A ripple of chuckles spread through the nearby customers. Someone whispered something Emma couldn't quite catch, but the judgment in their tone needed no translation. Emma's face burned. She tightened her grip on the shoes, her fingers trembling, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything. Else, she could have turned around. She could have thrown the shoes down and left. But Emma didn't move. She lifted her chin just a little, forcing her face into a soft, almost apologetic smile. When she reached the counter, Brittany barely looked at her, still snickering with her coworker. Emma placed the shoes carefully on the counter and pulled out a crumpled handful of cash. Singles, fives, a few coins. She laid them out methodically, smoothing each bill as if it might somehow make her invisible. Brittany rolled her eyes, but started counting the money anyway. "It's not about the price," Emma said quietly, her voice steady despite the tight knot in her chest. "It's about what they mean." She didn't expect an answer, and she didn't get one. Brittany just shrugged, handed her the plastic bag, without meeting her eyes, and turned to gossip with the next customer. Emma took the bag carefully, as if it was something fragile, and stepped aside. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. The sound of low, cruel laughter chased her all the way to the mall's polished glass doors. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the floor as she hurried toward the exit, her face hot with humiliation, her eyes blurring the world into a smear of lights and colors. Still, she kept walking, one foot in front of the other, her shoulders straight even though every step felt like it might shatter her. A few paces away, near the stockroom door, an older man in a faded store uniform watched her go. He said nothing, did nothing to stop the laughter, but there was a weight in his gaze, a quiet sympathy that lingered even after Emma disappeared into the crowd. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, making her gasp. She stood there for a moment, gripping the bag, feeling the sharp plastic handles dig into her fingers. The parking lot stretched out before her, filled with cars and rushing people and blinking holiday lights that blurred into stars against the early evening sky. Emma wiped her sleeve across her eyes and took a deep breath. She hadn't cried when she lost her job 6 months ago. She hadn't cried when she skipped meals to pay rent. But standing there, clutching a pair of cheap shoes she had sacrificed so much for after being laughed at like she didn't matter, it cracked something open inside her that she couldn't patch back together. She turned away from the doors, clutching the bag closer to her chest like it could shield her from the world, and started walking across the lot toward the bus stop. Behind the windows, Brittany laughed again, flipping her hair dramatically as she recounted the scene for a coworker. Emma didn't hear it, but she didn't have to. She could feel it in her bones, the kind of laughter that doesn't stop at what you wear or what you can afford, the kind that tries to tell you you're small, that you don't belong. Emma kept walking. She reached the bus stop and sat heavily on the bench, the cold metal seeping through her jeans. She placed the bag on her lap and opened it carefully, pulling out the shoes. They were nothing special, plain white canvas, the kind that would wear out by the end of the season. But to her, they were proof. Proof that she could still work towards something, still dream a little, even when life tried to crush the dreams out of her. She ran her fingers along the stitching, feeling the rough texture against her skin, and smiled through the tears she no longer tried to hide. The bus rumbled into view, headlights casting long shadows across the parking lot. Emma stood, tucking the shoes back into the bag, and climbed aboard without looking back. As the bus pulled away, the mall grew smaller in the distance, its neon lights flickering against the darkening sky. Inside the mall, Mr. Harris, the older employee, finished stacking boxes near the stockroom door. He glanced once more toward the exit where Emma had disappeared, his expression unreadable. Then he turned back to his work, moving a little slower than before, the laughter from the registers still echoing faintly in the air. Emma sat hunched on the cold metal bench just outside the mall's main entrance, the thin plastic shopping bag cradled in her lap like something precious. She wiped at her eyes with the sleeve of her jacket, trying to push down the lump in her throat. The world blurred around her, the shuffle of shoes on concrete, the distant honk of a car, the faint clinking of a shopping cart rolling across the lot. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the cold air and vanish. Instead, she sat frozen, caught between humiliation and a quiet, stubborn sadness she couldn't shake off. Through the glass doors, voices carried clearly, sharper in the chill evening air. Brittany's voice, high-pitched and cutting, rang out across the entrance. She was actually crying, she laughed, practically shouting so others could hear. Over those ratty little shoes, like, is this her first pair or something? Another employee, a young guy wearing a store vest and an oversized grin, chuckled along. Emma flinched. She didn't need to turn around to picture them. Brittany tossing her hair, smirking, tossing little verbal darts like a kid pulling wings. Off a fly. A heavy sigh came from somewhere nearby. Emma glanced up just as a figure approached. Slow, unhurried steps, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded store uniform. Mr. Harris, the older man she'd noticed earlier, stopped a few feet away. His lined face held no judgment, only a quiet kind of understanding that made Emma want to hide her face even more. He didn't say anything at first, just pulled a clean tissue from his pocket and held it out to her with a slight nod. "People forget," he said gently, voice low and steady. "They forget what it's like to need something small to feel big." His words weren't rushed or heavy. They just settled in the space between them, soft and real. Emma hesitated, then reached out and took the tissue with a shaky hand. She mumbled a thank you, her voice rough from trying not to cry. Mr. Harris just gave a slight nod and sat down, on the other end of the bench, far enough to give her space, but close enough that she didn't feel invisible. For a minute, neither of them spoke. Emma dabbed at her eyes, then crumpled the tissue in her fist. She didn't know why she opened her mouth next. Maybe it was the kindness, or maybe she just needed to say it out loud. "I'm a waitress," she said, staring straight ahead at the parking lot. "Been saving tips for months, just to get some decent shoes." Something new for once, something that didn't come from a lost and found or a thrift store bin. Mr. Harris leaned back against the bench, the metal creaking softly under his weight. "Rough year?" he asked. No pity in his tone, just genuine curiosity. Emma gave a dry, little laugh. "You could say that. Lost my job at a diner last winter. Couldn't keep up with rent. Had to crash with a cousin who's less than thrilled about it. Been picking up shifts wherever I can. Saving $1 here, $2 there. Figured I deserved one thing for myself, you know." Her voice wobbled a little at the end, but she swallowed it down. Mr. Harris nodded slowly, eyes on the horizon where the sun had dipped below the buildings, leaving only a smear of pink in the sky. "I've seen a lot of people pass through that store," he said after a while. "Some come in flashing credit cards like they're playing with Monopoly money. Others hold on to every penny like it's a lifeline. Folks behind the counter don't always notice the difference. Or maybe they just forget to care." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It didn't fix anything. She still felt raw and small and tired. But somehow, hearing it put into words made her feel a little less alone. Inside the mall, the laughter continued. Brittany threw her arm around the young guy's shoulders, tossing another mocking comment Emma couldn't quite catch, but the tone was clear enough. They were still talking about her, still laughing, still acting like it was the funniest thing in the world that someone had dared to want something so small, and to care about it so much. Emma tightened her hand around the bag in her lap. She wasn't angry, not exactly. The heat she felt in her chest wasn't the kind that burned out quickly. It was slower, steadier, something deeper, almost like resolve. She looked down at the shoes again, their simple white canvas gleaming under the mall lights. They didn't look like much to anyone else, but, to her, they were a promise, a start. She turned slightly toward Mr. Harris. "Thanks," she said, voice stronger now, steadier. "Not just for the tissue." He smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Sometimes you just need someone to see you," he said. "Not judge, just see." Emma nodded. She stood, smoothing the front of her jacket, and tucked the bag carefully under her arm. Mr. Harris didn't say anything else, just tipped an imaginary hat at her, a silent farewell that said more than words could. Emma turned towards the mall doors again. Through the glass, she caught a glimpse of Brittany tossing her head back in laughter, her bracelets jingling, her voice bright and careless. The scene that had humiliated Emma only minutes ago now looked different. Smaller, somehow. Less important. She didn't have to shout, she didn't have to fight back. She just had to remember. As she walked away, the bag tucked safely against her side, her steps felt a little firmer. She didn't glance over her shoulder to check if anyone was watching. She didn't need to. Somewhere deep inside her, something had shifted, a quiet, solid place that Brittany's laughter couldn't reach. Back inside the store, the staff kept laughing, oblivious to the change. They didn't notice the girl who had walked out quietly wasn't quite the same one they had mocked. But they would. Soon enough, they would. The mall buzzed with the same low thrum of weekend shoppers, but Emma's steps were different this time. There was no hesitation in the way she moved across the gleaming floors, no lingering glances toward the flashy window displays or clearance signs. She clutched a small leather folder under her arm, her chin lifted just slightly higher than before. Her modest clothes were the same, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. But there was something in her presence now, something solid, unshakable. Near the center court, just outside the shoe store that still flashed its bright sale signs, a man in a crisp grey suit stood waiting, tapping a pen against a stack of papers in his hand. His polished shoes gleamed under the overhead lights, and his tailored jacket looked like it cost more than everything Emma owned. He spotted her and offered a professional smile, one that carried a hint of respect rather than condescension. Emma approached him without faltering. As she came into view, Brittany, perched behind the cash register inside the store, caught sight of her. She leaned toward a co-worker, smirking broadly. "Still window shopping, huh?" she said loud enough to carry across the walkway, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. The co-worker laughed along, tossing a quick glance at Emma before turning back to fold shirts in exaggerated disinterest. Emma heard it. Of course she heard it. But instead of shrinking back, she simply turned her head slightly, meeting Brittany's, gaze across the short distance. She didn't glare, didn't snap. She just smiled, a small, knowing smile that barely touched her lips but said more than any comeback could have. Then she turned back to the man in the suit without missing a step, her voice calm and even as she greeted him. "Mr. Landry, thanks for meeting me." "Pleasure's mine," he replied smoothly, flipping open the folder he carried. "I've got everything ready, just need your signature to finalize." A few feet away, hidden in the shadows near a potted plant display, Mr. Harris leaned lightly on his broom, pretending to sweep while his eyes stayed fixed on the pair. He watched as Emma nodded, her expression serious, her hand steady as she took the pen and signed several papers without hesitation. Mr. Landry spoke quietly, explaining a few legal terms here and there, but he treated her as an equal, not like a charity case or a customer to brush off. When the last page was signed, he snapped the folder shut with a satisfied nod and extended his hand. Emma shook it firmly. The exchange was simple, businesslike, but in the fluorescent-lit world of clearance racks and cheap gossip, it was something seismic. Mr. Harris saw it. He couldn't hear their exact words, but he didn't need to. Respect wasn't hard, too. Recognize when you'd spent a lifetime watching people ignore it. Inside the store, Brittany watched too, arms crossed, her amusement faltering just slightly. She nudged her co-worker with an elbow. "What's that about? Maybe she's suing us for hurting her little feelings," she joked, trying to summon another round of laughter. But the co-worker only chuckled weakly, his eyes flicking uncertainly between Emma and the suited man. Something about the scene didn't fit the narrative Brittany had been spinning. Emma tucked the now-signed folder back under her arm and exchanged a few last words with Mr. Landry. He handed her another thick envelope. White, heavy, the kind that usually came with serious, binding decisions inside. And with a nod, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in the center court. She didn't rush. She didn't even glance back at the store where Brittany was whispering furiously to her co-worker, throwing suspicious looks toward her. Emma took a slow, deep breath, feeling the weight of the papers against her side, feeling the change crackling just under the surface. Every insult, every laugh, every dismissive look had stacked up into something stronger than she had ever thought herself capable of building. Mr. Harris set down his broom and straightened up, still watching. He didn't smile, didn't move, to congratulate her, but there was a quiet gleam of recognition in his eyes. He didn't know exactly what had just happened, but he knew enough. He had seen enough in his years to recognize when the ground was about to shift under people's feet. Emma turned and began walking toward the mall exit, her steps unhurried, the thin soles of her sneakers whispering against the polished tiles. Inside the store, Brittany watched her go, then barked out a loud laugh, tossing her hair over one shoulder. "Good riddance," she said to no one in particular. Maybe she finally found somewhere cheap enough for her taste. The other employees chuckled uneasily, their laughter ringing hollow in the open air. Emma didn't react. She kept moving, her face calm, her grip firm on the envelope tucked close to her side. The glass door slid open ahead of her, and she stepped into the cool air without looking back. Brittany's laughter faded behind her, growing smaller with each step she took. She didn't need them to see her now. Soon enough, they would. The tiny bell above the coffee shop door jingled as Emma stepped inside, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear as she scanned the room. The air was warm, filled with the smell of roasted beans and something sweet baking behind the counter. Mr. Landry was already seated at a corner table, a thick folder spread out in front of him, a steaming cup of coffee sitting untouched by his elbow. Emma crossed the room quietly, the heels of her worn sneakers making soft sounds against the scuffed wooden floor. "Emma," he greeted, rising slightly from his chair in a gesture of old-fashioned politeness. "Glad you made it." She smiled, and slid into the seat across from him, setting her bag carefully at her feet. Her fingers tugged unconsciously at the frayed edge of her jacket sleeve as she glanced down at the paperwork waiting for her. Mr. Landry flipped open the folder and pushed it toward her, his expression professional but kind. "It's all in order," he said. "The transfer, the lease, everything we discussed." Emma nodded, tracing the edge of a document with the tip of her finger. It felt surreal, almost like stepping into someone else's life. Only a few weeks ago, she had been standing in this same mall, humiliated over a pair of discount shoes. Now here she was, a signature away from something she never would have dared to imagine for herself. She hesitated, pen hovering just above the first line. Mr. Landry watched her patiently, giving her space. The noise of the cafe wrapped around them, cups clinking, low conversation, the hum of an espresso machine hissing in the background, but inside their little corner it felt quiet, still. "I keep thinking," Emma said finally, her voice soft, but steady, "whether this is revenge. If it's wrong to want this just because they laughed at me." Mr. Landry leaned back slightly, resting one arm casually across the back of his chair. "You're not trying to hurt anyone," he said. "You're building something. There's a difference." He paused, letting the words settle before adding, "Sometimes change doesn't come by waiting for permission. Sometimes you have to make it yourself." Emma absorbed that in silence, the pen tapping lightly against the paper. She thought of her grandmother, the tiny woman with the calloused hands and the fierce, stubborn heart. She had worked her whole, life cleaning other people's houses, dreaming aloud that one day they'd have something of their own, something with their name on it. Emma's chest tightened. It had never happened for her grandmother. But maybe it could happen now. My grandmother left it for me, Emma said quietly, answering a question Mr. Landry hadn't asked. Not much, but enough. She always said, owning something, even something small, it changes how you walk through the world. Mr. Landry nodded, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Wise woman. Emma let out a breath, not quite a laugh, but close. She steadied her hand, pressed the pen firmly against the paper, and signed. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of something fiercer, something rooted deeper than any humiliation. Brittany could have dished out, a belief that people like her deserved better, deserved places where they didn't have to apologize for what they could afford or who they were. As she finished signing the last page, Mr. Landry gathered the documents neatly into the folder and slid it into his briefcase. Congratulations, he said, offering his hand again. Emma shook it, feeling the strange weight of it all settling onto her shoulders. It wasn't heavy. It felt like armor. They exchanged a few more quiet words, details about the next steps, the renovation schedules, the contractors who'd be coming through. But Emma barely heard them. Her mind buzzed with the enormity of what she had just done, but at the same time, a strange calmness threaded through her veins. After finishing her coffee with slow, deliberate sips, she left the cafe and crossed the parking lot back toward the mall. The late afternoon light slanted across the asphalt, painting long shadows that stretched toward the glass entrance. She moved without hurrying, without hesitation, her sneakers carrying her steadily across the familiar path. Inside, the mall looked the same. Shiny floors, chattering crowds, the clatter of shopping bags and strollers. But to Emma, everything felt slightly different, like the floor had shifted a few degrees under her feet. She walked past the food court, past the kiosks, hawking phone cases and cheap jewelry, until she reached the familiar storefront. The shoe store buzzed with its usual energy, customers browsing, employees folding clothes, Brittany tossing her hair and laughing loudly behind the counter as she flirted with a customer. Emma paused just outside the entrance, far enough not to be noticed, close enough to take it all in. Above the glass windows, partially hidden behind a promotional banner, hung a modest sign in red and white. For lease. Available immediately. Emma's eyes locked onto it, and a slow, quiet smile curved her lips. She wasn't looking at the shoes anymore, not at the clearance bins or the judgmental stares. She was looking at the space itself, the walls, the floors, the potential. She wasn't here to cry over cheap shoes or to beg for dignity. She was here to own her place in the world. Inside, Brittany tossed another careless look toward the entrance, saw nothing worth noticing, and went back to chatting and laughing as if the future weren't already creeping toward her with every tick of the clock. Emma turned away, the envelope tucked securely under her arm, her footsteps sure and unhurried as she melted back into the crowd. There was no need for fanfare, no need to announce anything. The change was already happening. The first signature had been inked. The first wall had shifted, and soon enough, the ones who had laughed the hardest would find themselves standing on shaky ground. The store buzzed with an odd kind of energy that morning, the kind that made the younger employees exchange glances and whisper behind clothing racks. Something was off. They had been told to arrive an hour earlier than usual, all staff present, no exceptions. The manager, a heavy-set man named Carl with a perpetually bored expression, stood by the front register, clutching a clipboard and fidgeting more than usual. Brittany leaned against the counter, chewing gum loudly, her arms crossed, her polished nails tapping impatiently against the laminate surface. "What's the big emergency?" she muttered to a co-worker, her voice loud enough to carry. "Probably. Some boring new policy, maybe a dress code or something stupid." Her co-worker shrugged, but both their heads turned when the mall doors swung open. Emma walked in, flanked by Mr. Landry, her lawyer, both of them moving with an ease that seemed to ripple through the space. Emma was dressed no differently than before, jeans, simple jacket, plain sneakers, but something about her posture made people straighten up as she passed. She wasn't here to shop today. She wasn't here to plead or be overlooked. She was here for something entirely different. Carl cleared his throat awkwardly and tapped the side of his clipboard with his pen. "All right, everyone, listen up," he said, voice wobbling slightly before he steadied it. "There's been a change in ownership, effective immediately." He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Emma, then back to the employees now gathering in, a loose, uneasy circle. "Your new boss would like to introduce herself." There was a pause, a thick, breathless beat of silence, as Emma stepped forward. Brittany squinted at her, confusion knitting her perfectly arched eyebrows. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Wait, her!" she blurted, pointing openly. "This is a joke, right?" Emma didn't flinch. She smiled, small and sure, and took another step forward. Mr. Landry remained just behind her, his briefcase in one hand, but he wasn't needed to say a word. This was Emma's moment. "My name is Emma Hart," she said clearly, her voice carrying without having to shout. "As of today, I'm the new owner of this store." The words hit like a dropped glass. The room practically vibrated with the tension that followed. Several employees looked at each other, unsure if they should clap or run. Brittany's mouth hung open slightly, a flush creeping up her neck. She opened it to speak, closed it, then tried again. You're kidding. You're the girl who cried over shoes," she stammered, her tone swinging wildly between disbelief and panic. Emma tilted her head slightly, studying her. "I'm the woman who believed people deserved to be treated with respect," she said, each word deliberate, measured. "Effective today, we're changing more than just the signage. We're changing the culture, too." Carl, relieved beyond measure not to have to be the messenger any longer, stepped aside. Two mall security guards, summoned quietly beforehand, entered the store and stood by the doorway. Emma's gaze swept over the staff, her expression steady. "Anyone who thinks mocking customers or humiliating people is acceptable," she continued, her tone still polite but edged with steel, "will find their last paycheck waiting for them." Brittany sputtered. "You can't just— This is ridiculous. I've been here for years," she snapped, her arms flailing slightly, as if trying to grab hold of her slipping power. "You're right," Emma said, her smile never quite touching her eyes. "You have been here for years, and for years you've helped create an environment where kindness was optional. That ends today." At a nod from Carl, the security guards approached Brittany. Her protests rose, loud and sharp, but no one stepped in to defend her, not her co-workers, not the manager, certainly not the customers, who were beginning to gather around the entrance, drawn by the commotion. Brittany's voice cracked as she tried one last desperate appeal, but it fell flat against the silence. She was escorted out, still shouting, still struggling to spin the story into something where she wasn't the villain. Emma watched her go without a flicker of satisfaction or cruelty. She didn't need to gloat. The act of standing there, steady and unshaken, was enough. The other staff stood frozen, eyes wide, waiting. Emma turned to them, her voice softening. "We're starting fresh," she said. "If you're willing to work hard to treat every person who walks through those doors with the dignity they deserve, there's a place for you here. If not—" She let the words hang, unfinished but understood. The tension eased slightly. A few nodded. One or two even looked relieved. Not everyone had been cruel. Some had simply been silent, caught up in the tide. Emma knew the difference. The crowd outside the store murmured among themselves, watching the scene unfold like a slow, unexpected storm. They hadn't seen the warning signs. They hadn't noticed the shift when it was still small and quiet. But now it was impossible to ignore. Emma moved to the front display where the clearance rack used to be, where the flashy posters once shouted about deep discounts. The space was empty now, stripped down to bare shelves. She reached into the EID shopping bag Mr. Landry handed her, the same crinkled plastic bag she had carried out of this store not so long ago, and pulled out the pair of simple canvas shoes. She placed them gently on the center shelf, no price tag, no flashy sign. Just the shoes, worn proudly like a badge of honor. People noticed. Customers paused at the entrance, reading the new signs about store values and customer care. They didn't know the full story, not yet. But they felt the difference. They felt the shift. Emma stood there for a moment, hands in her pockets, surveying the store she now owned, the same place where she had once been made to feel small. She didn't need applause. She didn't need a grand speech. The shoes said everything. She had come back, not to ask for acceptance, but to claim her place, with grace, with strength, and with an unshakable belief that dignity should never be a luxury item. The hammering echoed through the empty store, a steady rhythm of change. Dust hung lightly in the air, caught by the sunlight streaming through the glass storefront. Emma stood in the center of it all, clipboard in hand, ticking off items one by one as workers moved around her. The tired, worn shelves were being replaced with warm wooden displays. The harsh fluorescent lighting was swapped for softer, more welcoming bulbs. Bright posters featuring smiling employees and customers went up on the freshly painted walls, their bold letters declaring simple but powerful values: respect every customer, kindness is strength, service with heart. She paused near the register, where a rack of new uniforms hung neatly. Simple, comfortable clothes in soft tones, nothing flashy or intimidating. Emma ran her fingers over the fabric, feeling the promise stitched into every seam. No one working here would ever be made to feel less than. Not on her watch. Near the back of the store, Mr. Harris carefully swept away the last of the construction dust. His movements were unhurried but steady, as if the broom were an extension of him, as natural as breathing. Emma watched him for a moment, a small smile tugging at her mouth. She tucked her clipboard under her arm and walked over. "Mr. Harris," she said, her tone warm but direct. "I've been thinking about something." He looked up, eyebrows raised slightly, in mild curiosity. "I need someone to manage the store," she continued. "Someone who understands what this place is really about. Someone who sees people, not just price tags." She hesitated for half a second, then smiled fully. "I'd like you to be that person." Mr. Harris blinked, caught off guard for the first time since Emma had met him. His hands stilled on the broom handle, and he straightened slowly. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded once, deeply, like a man accepting a responsibility far heavier than a job title. "I'd be honored," he said simply. Emma reached out and shook his hand, her grip firm, her eyes bright. "The honor's mine," she replied. The days that followed were a blur of work and quiet victories. Emma walked the floor daily, not as a distant owner barking orders from behind a desk, but as a present, grounded leader. She trained new hires herself, showing them how to greet every customer with sincerity, not sales pitches. She helped design a wall where employees could pin thank you notes from happy customers or milestones they were proud of. Graduations, first apartments, small and big wins alike. It wasn't just about selling anymore, it was about building something human. Word traveled fast. At first, a few cautious shoppers trickled in, curiosity pulling them through the doors. They expected the same cold indifference, the same snickering glances if they dared to linger too long near the sale racks. Instead, they were met with genuine smiles, patient service, and small acts of kindness that made them stay longer than they planned. One woman, clutching a handful of clearance clothes, whispered to the cashier, "Feels different here now, in a good way." Another, who had once stormed out of the old store in frustration, came back just to say thank you for how her daughter had been treated. Even those who had once chuckled at Emma's tears began to notice. They wandered through the aisles with a strange mixture of awe and discomfort, realizing too late that they had mistaken kindness for weakness. Emma didn't hold grudges. She didn't need to. The change spoke louder than anything she could have said. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind the mall roof and the store's new lights cast a warm glow across the shelves, Emma stood behind the counter, restocking small items near the register. She wore the new uniform like everyone else, blending in, a quiet part of the steady hum of life filling the space. She was adjusting a row of colorful shoelaces when an older man approached the counter, holding a pair of polished dress shoes. He set them down carefully and looked at her with a smile. "First time I came here," he said, voice low but kind. "Felt like they were doing me a favor just letting me shop. Today it feels like a place a person belongs." Emma felt something stir in her chest, a warmth, a fullness she hadn't known she was waiting for. She smiled, genuine and unguarded, a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning every word. As the man left, tipping his hat slightly, Emma looked around the store, watching the employees laugh quietly among themselves as they helped customers, watching Mr. Harris patiently explaining sizing options to a confused teenager, watching a little girl twirl in a new pair of glittery sneakers near the entrance. This wasn't just a store anymore. It was a place of second chances, quiet dignity, small but powerful changes stitched into every inch of the space. A place where people like her, people who had once been made to feel invisible, could be seen, valued, and celebrated. Emma leaned lightly against the counter, the faint buzz of life around her, and allowed herself a moment of peace. She didn't need the world to know every detail of the journey that had brought her here. She didn't need banners or headlines or applause. The simple hum of voices, the creak of shopping carts, the laughter of strangers, that was enough. She had built something real. And for the first time in a very long time, Emma Hart smiled like she truly belonged. The morning air outside the mall was bright and buzzing with anticipation. A small crowd had gathered by the newly polished storefront, their faces turned toward the fluttering ribbons that framed the entrance. The store's name, once hidden behind garish sale banners and dusty posters, now gleamed in simple, elegant letters that spoke more of welcome than exclusivity. Emma stood just behind the thick red ribbon, a pair of shiny silver scissors in her hand, her heart thudding. Not with nerves, but with something sweeter. Pride, steady and calm. Mall visitors gathered closer, phones lifted, smiles bright. A few reporters from the local news channel stood with microphones ready, jostling politely for position. Behind Emma, her employees stood in neat rows, Mr. Harris among them, a quiet pillar of strength. The employees wore their new uniforms proudly, their name tags shining under the morning sun. A small cheer rose up as the mall's event coordinator stepped forward with a quick introduction, her words cheerful and clipped. Then she turned the microphone over to Emma, stepping back with a broad, encouraging grin. Emma took a small breath, smoothing the front of her jacket, and stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice clear but warm, carrying easily over the crowd without needing to shout. "This isn't just a grand reopening, it's a beginning." She glanced back toward her team, who smiled encouragingly. "This store, it was once just a place to buy cheap shoes. For some, maybe that's all it'll ever be. But for many of us, it's more. It's a reminder that dignity isn't something you should have to afford. It's something you should be given. Always." A hush fell over the crowd. A collective breath held tight. Emma's voice softened, carrying an emotional undercurrent she didn't try to hide. "My grandmother used to tell me that owning something, even something small, could change how you walk through the world. She never got to see this day, but everything she taught me is built into these walls." She paused, letting the silence settle gently around them, before smiling and finishing simply. "This store isn't about luxury. It's about dignity." For a beat, the world seemed to hold still, and then the applause started, warm and genuine. The sound filled the mall's open space, echoing off the glass and tile, a swelling tide that Emma let wash over her without fear. She smiled, real and wide, and lifted the scissors, cutting through the ribbon in one clean, satisfying snip. The crowd surged forward, streaming into the store with a kind of cautious wonder, taking in the bright new displays, the handwritten signs offering discounts, the little details that said more about the heart of the place than any price tag ever could. Customers wandered in, touching the merchandise carefully, speaking in hushed, almost reverent tones. The news cameras captured it all. The laughing children trying on new sneakers, the grandparents examining sturdy winter boots, the teenagers marveling at how friendly the staff were. Somewhere near the entrance, Emma gave a short interview, her words simple and heartfelt. She wasn't trying to sell a brand. She was telling a story. Her story. And through it, the story of everyone who had ever been made to feel small for wanting something better. As the reporters packed up and the excitement began to settle into a steady hum of shoppers, Emma made her way to the front of the store. She knelt near a low display shelf, straightening a few rows of shoes, her movements unhurried and familiar. It felt good to be here, grounded, part of the life she had built, instead of floating somewhere outside of it. A small shadow crossed her vision, and she looked up to see a little girl standing nearby, clutching a pair of simple white sneakers to her chest. The shoes weren't fancy, no flashing lights, no glitter, but the way the girl held them, wide-eyed and beaming, made them look like treasure. Emma smiled and crouched down so they were eye level. "Those are beautiful," she said softly. The girl nodded shyly, tightening her grip on the shoes. Her mother, standing a few steps behind, gave a small, grateful smile, but didn't interrupt. Emma leaned in a little closer, her voice low and conspiratorial. "You know what? So are you." The little girl's face lit up, and for a second, the whole store, the whole world, seemed to glow a little brighter. Emma tapped the girl's sneakers lightly and straightened up, watching as the child skipped back to her mother, shoes still clutched proudly in her arms. Emma stood quietly for a moment longer, taking it all in, the laughter, the small kindnesses exchanged at the counters, the way people lingered, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This was what she had fought for. Not a business, a haven. She moved back behind the counter, organizing receipts, greeting customers, slipping seamlessly into the rhythm of the day. No one treated her like a symbol or a boss to be feared. They treated her like one of them, and that was exactly how she wanted it. The camera would have caught her if anyone had still been filming. Emma Hart, once laughed at, once dismissed, standing in the heart of her store with a quiet strength no one could take away. But she didn't think about cameras. She didn't need to. The real proof was in every handshake, every smile, every pair of shoes that walked out the door a little more proudly worn. As the scene faded to the soft sounds of the bustling store, a final voiceover played gently, as if carried on the hum of a day well earned. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more real, powerful human stories.